Hi, this is the online review session for the General Curriculum MTEL, the Mathematics subtest. There will be 3 sessions. The first session is going to give a quick overview of the MTEL. Then we'll look at what's going to be on the math subtest. We'll look at how scoring works, and then just some general tips for testing and studying. The second session looks at the open response question. There's a Quizlet to help you review some vocabulary that you might want to use to make your answer stronger. Then some general tips for answering an open response question and some strong and weak examples. Then the third session focuses on multiple choice questions, gives some general tips about answering those types of questions, and we'll look at some example questions. So the General Curriculum MTEL is made up of 2 subtests. There's the multi-subject subtest and the math subtest. This review session is for the math subtest part. So the math subtest has 45 multiple choice questions and 1 open response question. You get 4 hours and 15 minutes for the total appointment. So then you have the choice to take both subtests in one appointment or split them up and take 1 subtest per appointment. So you could have 4 hours and 15 minutes for both of them, or split them up and have 4 hours and 15 minutes for the math subtest only, and then 4 hours and 15 minutes for the multi-subject only. But that's totally up to you. The math subtest content. So the sub areas on the math subtest are numbers and operations, functions and algebra, geometry and measurement, and statistics and probability. So those are generally the main category, and then each part is split up into different test objectives. This also shows you that the multiple choice, it's weighted for 90% of your score, and then your open response is 10% of your score. This part breaks each sub area down into the test objectives, so specifically what the MTEL is testing. My suggestion is that you go through this and check off each objective that you know really well. Put a question mark next to an objective that you have some questions about, and then put an X next to the objectives that you don't know at all. So then when you go through and take your practice test, you can focus on the questions that measure the objectives that you aren't so sure about, so that you can practice answering some questions about those objectives that you thought that you might need more practice on. So for the number and operations sub area, there are 4 objectives that they're looking at. The objectives are written in white, so I'm going to read each objective and then explain what some of the questions might look like. So the first one is understand the number system and the concept of place value. So you might be asked to analyze the structures and properties of the base 10 models. So you could be asked to represent a number in an expanded form, visually represent the number using place value. And then you might also be asked to identify subsets of the real numbers. So whether it's an integer, whether it's a rational or irrational, and then characteristics of each. The second objective is looking at your understanding of integers, fractions, decimals, percents, and mixed numbers. So they want to know whether you understand the meanings of these and the models, and then also whether you can compare, sort, and order these numbers. Then the third is understanding and applying the principles of number theory. So some questions may have you identify prime and composite numbers and their characteristics, find the least common multiple and greatest common factor of a set of numbers, and then applying least common multiple and greatest common factor in real-world situations. And the last objective is understanding operations on numbers. So whether you are able to apply the order of operations, the laws of exponents, whether you're able to use these operations and apply appropriate strategies, and then whether you're able to solve problems using these operations and representations of numbers. For functions in algebra, there are 3 test objectives. The first one being understand algebra as generalized arithmetic. So being able to use algebra to solve word problems, and then recognizing patterns and manipulating algebraic expressions. The second objective is understanding the concept of function. So understanding the definition of function and then various representations. So you might see an input-output table or a graph or some diagrams. And then translating what that means and the relationships that those tables and diagrams are showing. The third objective is understand linear functions and linear equations. So recognizing the formula and graphing it, and then also interpreting it. So understanding the meaning of the slope and the intercepts of the equation, and then how that would be modeled in a real-world situation. For geometry and measurement, there are 2 objectives. You want to understand and apply concepts of measurement. So this includes calculating measurements, unit conversions, and then also measurements such as lengths, perimeters, areas, volumes, and surface areas, and then solving questions based on a variety of measurements. So, for example, time or temperature. The second objective is understand and apply concepts of geometry. So looking at polygons and sides and angles, classifying shapes, and then also applying geometric transformations, so translations, rotations, reflections, and then also recognizing and applying connections between algebra and geometry, so using coordinate systems or the Pythagorean theorem. Any of these vocabulary words that you need reminders on are in the Quizlet for the second session. So this kind of just gives a basic overview of the objectives that are on the MTEL. For statistics and probability, there are also 2 objectives. Understanding descriptive statistics, so looking at the mean, the median, and the mode, and how you could describe and interpret data. And then also comparing different sets. And the second objective is understand and apply basic concepts of probability. So you might be asked to calculate probabilities and then also analyze what they would mean and apply them. The last test objective is for the open response question. So the open response question is looking at your ability to apply mathematical knowledge and reasoning. And it may involve 2 or more of the sub-areas. So you might be asked a question that uses numbers and operations and statistics and probability. you might be asked a question that uses any number of the sub-areas. And again, this would be assessed by the open response question that you are being asked. To pass the MTEL, you need a 240. So this is what your score sheet will look like. If you've taken an MTEL in the past, it's the same thing. This example shows the foundations of reading, but it's the same setup for the mathematics subtest. That first part will show you whether or not you met the qualifying score. So if you met it, it will say met the qualifying score. And if you didn't, it will say did not meet the qualifying score. Then 2 shows your actual score. If you meet the qualifying score, you just get those 3 dashes. And if you don't meet the qualifying score, then it gives you your actual score. 3 is the range of number of items in each sub-area. So you'll see all 4 sub-areas and then the number of questions that assessed each sub-area. 4 shows you your description of your sub-area performance, so whether you got most of the items correct, many of the items correct, some of the items, or few or no items. 5 gives you that multiple choice information, so how many you answered correctly. And then 6 looks at your open response, so whether your answer was thorough, adequate, limited, or weak. And then 7 is where you're reporting your score to. So again, the mathematics subtest has 45 multiple choice questions and 1 open response assignment. And then your passing score is a 240.
Both of these tutorials show you how to take the computer-based MTEL. The first tutorial shows how to generally take the test online. The second is specific to the math MTEL. The hand draw tutorial shows you how to hand draw things which you might have to do to answer some questions. And then it shows you how to scan it in to submit it with your test. This is an easy process, and they will review it when you are there for the test as well. This just gives you a quick overview.
So again, these tutorials are hyperlinks. The first one shows you an interactive of how the MTEL will look online. So if you haven't taken an MTEL before, that just gives you a quick idea of what it's like to take the computer-based test. And then the second hand draw tutorial is specific for the math subtest. When you're answering your open response, for example, you might want to draw a graph or a table that you want to include with your answer. Or if it's geometry, you might want to use a coordinate plane or draw a shape. So this allows you to be able to draw as part of your open response, and then this hand draw tutorial shows you how you'll scan it in to submit it with your test. Again, it will give you directions for how to do that when you take the MTEL, but this just gives you a quick overview for before you go. You have that option of being prepared for it and knowing what you're doing. Also, a good note is that there's no calculator allowed when taking the math subtest. So when you're taking your practice test, you might want to take the practice test without a calculator so that it simulates what the real MTEL experience would be like. Here are just some basic studying tips as you're preparing for your MTEL. Again, I would recommend reviewing the test objectives, checking off what you know, putting a question mark next to the objectives that you somewhat know, and then putting an X next to objectives that you don't know at all. So then when you take your practice test, you can go through and focus on those areas of weakness. When taking the practice test, there is an answer key with question analysis. So they go through and tell you why each answer is correct, and then also why the other answers are wrong. So that's helpful to read through and see, oh, well, I got A, and it's A because this, this, and this, or I got B, but that was wrong. So it will tell you why B is wrong and why A was the correct answer. So that's a helpful tool when you're identifying your strengths and weaknesses and what to study for. I also recommend that you create a study plan and kind of schedule in what you need to review so that you can do well. So once you pick an exam date, kind of working backwards and saying what you know, what you don't know, and what you'll need to spend some time really studying. So this is the end of the first session. The second session will look at open response questions, and then the third session will look at multiple choice questions.